As soon as full term at the university was over, Professor Parkins traveled down to Burnstow on the East Coast. The village boasted a fine golf course, and Parkins planned to spend a week or so there improving his game. He was soon installed in a large twin-bedded room at the Globe Inn, looking over the seashore. The rest of the population of the inn was naturally a golfing one, but the most conspicuous figure was an ancien militaire, secretary of a London club, a man with a bristling moustache and incarnadined features who was possessed of a voice of incredible strength and of views of a pronouncedly Protestant type. These were apt to find utterance after his attendance upon the ministrations of the vicar, an estimable man with inclinations towards a picturesque ritual. It was this Colonel Wilson in whose company Parkins spent the greater part of the following day, improving his game. And whether the process of improvement were to blame or not, by the end of the afternoon, the Colonel's demeanor had assumed a coloring so lurid that even Parkins jibbed at the thought of walking home with him from the links. He decided instead to go back to the inn by way of the beach, and while there was still enough light, to try and discover the site of an ancient Templar's preceptory, which he knew to be in the area. He soon found what he was looking for. A patch of somewhat broken ground covered with small depressions and mounds. At one end, there was an oblong eminence which could possibly have been the base of a platform or altar. It might, thought Parkins, be as well to probe the soil here for evidences of masonry, and he took out his knife and began scraping away the earth. Now followed another little discovery. A portion of soil fell inward as he scraped and disclosed a small cavity. As he withdrew the knife, he heard a metallic clink, and when he introduced his hand, it met with a cylindrical object lying on the floor of the hole. Naturally enough, he picked it up. And when he brought it out into the light, he could see that it was of man's making, a metal tube about 4 inches long, and evidently of some considerable age. By the time Parkins had made sure there was nothing else in the cavity, it was too late and too dark for him to think of undertaking any further search. The wind was bitter from the north, and he quickly rattled and clashed across the shingle towards the sand. One last look behind showed him a prospect of company on his walk in the shape of a rather indistinct personage who seemed to be making great efforts to catch up with him, but made little, if any, progress. Parkins decided that he almost certainly did not know this person, and that it would be absurd to wait until he came out. Besides, there was less than a quarter of an hour until dinner. And perhaps that is why Parkins felt obliged to run most of the way back to the inn without once looking behind him. When he met the Colonel at dinner, peace, or as much of it as that gentleman could manage, reigned once more on the military bosom. Nor was she put to flight in the hours of bridge that followed, for Parkins was a more than respectable player. He felt that he had spent his evening in quite a satisfactory way, and it was nearly midnight when he retired to his room and saw on the chest of drawers his little discovery of that afternoon. With some curiosity, he turned it over by the light of a candle. It was of bronze, he now saw, and was shaped very much like a modern dog whistle. Examining it more closely, he could see that there were marks on it, and not merely marks, but letters. Quis est iste qui venit. I am a little rusty in my Latin, thought Parkins, but it ought to mean, who is this who is coming? Well, the best way to find out is evidently to blow the whistle for him. He blew, tentatively, and stopped, suddenly, startled and yet pleased at the note he had elicited. It had a quality of infinite distance in it, and soft as it was, he somehow felt it must be audible for miles around. It was a sound, too, that seemed to have the power of forming pictures in the brain. He saw quite clearly for a moment a vision of a wide, dark expanse at night with a fresh wind blowing, and in the midst a lonely figure. How employed, he could not tell. Perhaps he would have seen more. But at that moment, there was a tremendous gust of wind. The window burst open, and both candles in the room were instantly extinguished. The force of the gale was enough to tear the room to pieces. Parkins, struggling with the casement, felt almost as if he were pushing back a sturdy burglar, so strong was the pressure. Then all at once it slackened, and the window banged to and latched itself. Quickly as it had risen, the wind did not fall at once. On it went, through the night, moaning and rushing past the house, at times rising to a cry so desolate that it might have made fanciful people feel quite uncomfortable. Even the unimaginative, thought Parkins as he lay in his bed, might be happier without it. Whether it was the wind or the excitement of golf or the researches in the preceptory that kept him awake, he was not sure. He found a little vicarious comfort in the idea that someone else was in the same boat, for he could hear one of his neighbors tossing and rustling in bed too. Finally, with many misgivings as to incipient failure of eyesight, overworked brain, excessive smoking, and so on, Parkins resigned himself to light a candle and read. The scraping of the match on the box and the glare of light must have startled some creatures of the night, rats or whatnot, which he heard scurry across the floor from the side of his bed with much rustling. The match went out before he could see anything, but the second one burned better, and the candle was duly lit. Parkins pored over a book until sleep of a wholesome kind came upon him, and for about the first time in his orderly and prudent life, he forgot to blow out the candle, so that when he woke in the morning, there was still a flicker in the socket and a sad mess of guttered grease on the top of the little table. After breakfast, he was in his room, putting the finishing touches to his golfing costume, when one of the maids came in. "Would you like any extra blankets on your bed, sir?" she asked. "Ah, thank you," said Parkins. "Yes, I think I should like one. It seems likely to turn colder." "Which bed should I put it on, sir?" "Why, the one I slept in last night," exclaimed Parkins. "I beg pardon, sir, but you seem to have tried both of them. Leastways, we had to make them both up this morning." "Really? How very absurd," said Parkins. "Well, I may have disordered it more than I thought when I unpacked my things. I'm very sorry to have given you the extra trouble, I'm sure." Then he set forth, with a stern determination to improve his game. I'm glad to be able to report that he succeeded so far in his enterprise that the colonel, whom fortune had again allotted to him for a partner, became quite chatty as the morning advanced. "Extraordinary wind we had last night," he boomed. "In my old home, we should have said that someone had been whistling for it." "Should you indeed?" said Parkins. "Well, I would certainly not hold with such a superstitious belief myself, though, as it happens, I was whistling last night, and the wind seemed to come absolutely in answer to my call." The colonel, upon hearing Parkins' account of the discovery of the whistle at the site of the Templars' preceptory, opined that he should be careful about using a thing that had belonged to a set of papists. After all, you never knew what they might have been up to. From this topic, he diverged to the enormities of the vicar, who, in the colonel's view, was at the least a concealed papist, if not a Jesuit. And Parkins, who could not very readily follow the colonel in this region, did not disagree with him. In fact, they got on so well together in the morning that there was no talk on either side of their separating after lunch. The subject of the whistle, however, was not raised again until after dinner, when Parkins produced it from his room for the colonel to see. The old warrior turned it over gingerly in the light of a candle. "What do you mean to do with it?" he asked. "Well, when I get it back to Cambridge, I shall submit it to some of the archaeologists there, and if they consider it worth having, I may present it to one of the museums." Said the colonel. "Well, you may be right. All I know is that if it were mine, I should chuck it straight into the sea. Still, I expect with you it's a case of live and learn. I hope so, I'm sure, and I wish you a good night." Parkins must have slept for an hour or more when a sudden sound shook him up in a most unwelcome manner. For some minutes he lay there. Then he turned over sharply and listened breathlessly with his eyes wide open. There had been a movement, he was sure, in the empty bed on the opposite side of the room. Now it began again. A rustling and shaking, surely more than any rat could cause. I can figure to myself something of the professor's bewilderment and horror, for I have in a dream 30 years back seen the same thing happen. But it will be hard, perhaps, to imagine how dreadful it was to him to see a figure suddenly sit up in what he had known was an empty bed. He was out of his own bed in one bound and made a dash towards the window where lay his only weapon, a walking stick. This was the worst thing he could have done, because the personage in the empty bed, with a sudden, smooth motion, moved across the room and took up a position with outspread arms in front of the door. Parkins watched it for some moments in a horrid perplexity. Somehow the idea of getting past it and escaping through the door was intolerable to him, And as for its touching him, he would sooner dash himself through the window than have that happen. It stood for a moment in a band of dark shadow. Then it began to move in a stooping posture. And all at once the spectator realized, with some horror and some relief, that it must be blind. For it seemed to feel about it with its muffled arms in a groping and random fashion. Turning half away from him, it became suddenly conscious of the bed he'd just left, darted towards it and bent over and felt in the pillows in a way which made Parkins shudder as he had never in his life thought it possible. In a very few moments, it seemed to know that the bed was empty. And then, moving forwards into the area of light and facing the window, it showed for the first time what manner of thing it was. Parkins, who very much dislikes being questioned about it, did once describe something of it in my hearing, and I gathered that what he chiefly remembers about it is a horrible, an intensely horrible face of crumpled linen. But he was not at leisure to watch it for long. With formidable quickness, it moved into the middle of the room. And as it groped and waved, one corner of its draperies swept across Parkins' face. Though he knew how perilous a sound was, he could not keep back a cry of disgust, and this gave the searcher an instant clue. It leapt towards him, and the next moment he was halfway through the window, backwards, uttering cry upon cry at the utmost pitch of his voice, and the linen face was thrust close into his own. At this almost the last possible second, deliverance came. The colonel burst the door open and was just in time to see the dreadful group at the window. When he reached the figures, only one was left. Parkins sank forward into the room in a faint, and before him on the floor lay a tumbled heap of bedclothes. Colonel Wilson asked no questions, but busied himself in keeping everyone else out of the room and in getting Parkins back to his bed, and himself, wrapped in a rug, occupied the other bed for the rest of the night. Early on the next day, he left the hotel door carrying a small object between his fingers and thumb, which he cast as far into the sea as a very brawny arm could send it. The whole thing, he said, served to confirm his opinion of the Church of Rome. There is really little more to tell. But as you may imagine, the professor's nerves have suffered. He cannot even now see a surplice hanging on a door, quite unmoved. And the spectacle of a scarecrow in a field late on a winter afternoon has cost him more than one sleepless night.